what I find a bit frustrating about some views of religion that are popular and widely discussed is that they treat religion simply as a set of propositions about the world, which clearly religion is not just that. It's a set of ideas that operate in powerful ways as identity markers, demarcating groups, and in some cases cranking up the commitment of members of the group to group values and group causes. And I think one very common mistake is to think of the rise of social complexity as being a sort of outcome of, shedding of religion, an enlightenment, a discovery that religion is basically false. When in fact I think religion has contributed in many ways quite profoundly to the evolution of social complexity and to the many intellectual traditions that have been born by that evolutionary process. So I think a simplistic negative view of religion is just both factually wrong and I guess intellectually and scientifically flawed. Initially when I arrived in the field, my interests were in economic anthropology, and so I was asking people lots of questions about topics like production and consumption and exchange, and people were really cooperative and helpful, and they tried to answer my questions, but it was also clear to me that this was not the most motivating topic for people, and what they were far more interested in discussing with me were their religious ideas and practices, of which they had a huge many. The people in the village in Papua New Guinea where I did my field work were all members of a religious movement calling itself the Kivung, which means a meeting, which is premised on the central idea that the ancestors of the group would soon return from the dead bearing all the amazing wealth and technology associated with European colonial invaders. This amazing wealth would sort of result in a period of bliss and paradise on earth where people would no longer suffer injury, illness, childbirth and all the sufferings that we know go along with life. But to bring it about they had to perform lots of specific rituals, and so I became fascinated by this whole system of beliefs, and that became really the focus of my research, taking over from the original focus on economic anthropology. So then what really struck me was that this Kivung movement had really two dimensions to it. On the one hand, it had this vast popular movement encompassing many, many villages that emphasized particular doctrines and particular practices that needed to be maintained in precisely the same way across many, many villages. And in order to accomplish that, they performed their rituals and repeated their doctrines publicly on a very regular basis. You could then standardize the tradition across a really wide area and have a sort of stable orthodoxy that united a large population. But at the same time, there were small cults within this large organization that had a very different kind of profile in terms of their rituals. They occurred, first of all, very infrequently. And they also involved a lot of emotional arousal, particularly what we call dysphoric or painful or frightening aspects. And these rare, intense, often rather unpleasant rituals seem to have a rather different consequence in terms of group formation. They seem to be producing very intensely cohesive but rather small groups where the ideas were difficult to spread, and even if you could spread them, difficult to standardize. But at the same time, people who performed these kind of rare, intense rituals seemed to have the impression that other people going through those experiences shared something really fundamental and important. And that sharing of what were very personally salient experiences with others, however illusory, provided a kind of foundation for attachment to a social group. It sort of broke down the boundary between the personal self and the social self. And later I met the social psychologist Bill Swan, who introduced me to his amazing ideas about identity fusion, and I realized this is what, psychologically, this is what I'd been studying for a long time, and now it became necessary to integrate these theoretical frameworks. Well, the people who'd been studying identity fusion had learned a lot of things about how to measure it, and what sort of consequences it had for people's behaviour. But very little was known about what caused identity fusion in the first place. We gradually came to the conclusion that fusion was a product, well, of sharing something important and salient with other people, and that sharing probably came about through the experience of living in families, right? Those are the people, it's your family members who provide you with the most profoundly salient shared experiences, and most people are fused with their families, even if with no other group. But it also seemed that some institutional arrangements seemed to act like gadgets to create the same sense of shared history, sometimes in a much more efficient way. Because if you go through a very intense ritual with a group of people, the experience can feel incredibly salient, incredibly significant, but actually take quite a short space of time to assemble in comparison with the many years that it takes to build fusion in families. And I think one of the key features of identity fusion is that a sort of functional equivalence between personal and social self, so that when somebody attacks your social identity, it feels like a personal attack. And that also means that fusion has consequences for what we call outgroup hostility and parochial altruism, the idea that you are of willingness to pay a big price personally for the sake of a group cause.
Kamin tau kale